Hello, this is Deb Wenger. So now this is where it starts to get fun. If you have great quotes, your story practically writes itself. But there are some rules about how to use quotes and how not to use them, and we're going to go over those today. So first let's start with a fundamental question. Why in the heck do we use quotes at all? Well, quotes add credibility to the story. So if you are doing a story about flu season, and you're quoting your next door neighbor who happens to be a landscaper, that doesn't have as much credibility. That information will not carry as much weight as an interview with the head of the state health department, right? So depending on who you quote, you can add a great deal of credibility to your story. And of course, there's the flip side to that. If you choose people to quote that aren't particularly strong sources, then your story may lose credibility. So that's why I'm really pushing you to find that expert, so that at the very heart of your story is someone who really knows the subject matter. And frankly, for your readers, quotes make a story more interesting. We'd almost always rather read about or hear about another person than another set of facts. There's a teacher at a journalism think tank down in St. Petersburg, Florida, called the Poynter Institute. And he says, you will remember what you feel much longer than what you know. And oftentimes it's the emotion that's created by the quotes in the story that help you remember a story years after you've watched it or read it. So there are a couple of different ways to handle quotes within your story. Most common, I think, for you will be direct quotes. So direct quotes are at least a complete sentence or two long, the speaker's exact words. So the fact that you are quoting someone in a complete sentence, that's really the heart of the direct quote. And when do you use direct quotes? Well, when you can't say the information better yourself. So if you get a great quote from the head of the health department saying he's really worried that this flu season is going to be the worst in Mississippi history, you want to use that as a direct quote because you want those words to come from the mouth of an expert. That same rule applies when the information is highly controversial or important. So clearly, if this is the worst flu season on record, that's really important. So you don't want to try to paraphrase or put into your own words something that's got that much significance. You usually can't better describe how somebody feels than they can themselves. So let's say you interview someone who's really concerned about the new rule in Mississippi that says you have to be able to read at a third grade level or you cannot progress to fourth grade. So you have a parent saying, I know my child is going to be a good reader, but right now I'm really worried that she'll be held back for a second year of third grade. Well, you're not going to say that as well as the mother whose heart is really coming out into those words. So sometimes direct quotes are called full quotes, and you may hear that term every now and then. So partial quotes. Partial quotes are when you use just one word or a phrase from someone's direct quote. So if somebody has a really rambling response to your question, you might just pull one or two words from what they had to say and paraphrase the rest. In a lead sentence, I would not use a direct quote. Please just stick to either paraphrase, which we'll talk about in just a second, or if there was one really compelling word or two really compelling words that somebody had to say, to incorporate those into a lead sentence might be appropriate. But you always have to be careful with any kind of quote, but certainly with a partial quote, because there's always that chance that when you pull one word or a phrase out of what somebody had to say, that it will be taken out of context. So you really have to discipline yourself to make sure that you're not changing the meaning of what that person had to say. Paraphrasing. Okay, so what does paraphrasing mean? If you've ever written an English paper, some kind of research paper, you know what paraphrasing means. So paraphrasing is essentially synthesizing the information that you've learned and put it in your own words. A lot of times I get students asking, what about attribution? Do I have to attribute information that I have paraphrased? Yes, absolutely. So if the thoughts are not your own, you need to tell us where those thoughts came from. Sometimes paraphrasing is the best approach to handling the information that you're getting in an interview or when you're looking at a government report. Oftentimes paraphrasing can help you simplify complicated ideas or thoughts. Paraphrasing can make something more concise. Obviously, it's a world where people are bombarded with information, so you want to make sure that you are not wasting their time and you're helping them understand something as quickly as possible. But with paraphrasing, you've got to be very careful. And why do you have to be very careful? Because of plagiarism. So if you take someone else's ideas and you pass them off as your own, you are plagiarizing. So that's why attribution is so critical, even when you're paraphrasing information. So let me show you some examples here of what I'm talking about. So this is a story about the U.S. Senate approving a stimulus plan for the U.S. And you look here about halfway down and you get a partial quote. So Mr. Obama said the passage of the Senate legislation was quote unquote good news, but warned there was still work to do. That's followed immediately by a direct quote. So you'll see here the quotation marks start with, we've still got to get the House bill and Senate bill to match up, etc. He said. So attributing what Mr. Obama had to say in the direct quote. And then that's followed by a paragraph that includes another partial quote from the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. And he says we have to get a completed version of the legislation as soon as possible. So you see how this story has a mix of both direct quotes and partial quotes right here. So attribution, you've heard me use that word. What am I talking about? So attribution is indicating who is being quoted and generally comes at the end of a direct quote. So let's take a look back here. You see the President Obama direct quote. That is attributed to him with the words he said. Put the attribution at the start of the quote if the information would otherwise be confusing. So if you have two quotes from two different people back to back, which is rare, but when it does happen, you want to make sure that you make it clear that the second quote is not coming from the same person. So in general, put your attribution at the end of the quote, and I'll show you a couple more examples of that as we go through this lecture. Sometimes people will split a quote with the attribution. So you see here, as any health threat emerges, fraudulent products appear almost overnight. Gary Cootie, National Health Fraud Coordinator, said in a statement, right now so-called alternatives to the flu vaccine are big with scammers. So what you see here is a direct quote with the attribution in the middle. So why would somebody do this? Because you want to establish quickly who is saying that fraudulent products are appearing. And then you want to go on and continue on with what this person had to say. So this kind of attribution is fine, but as you're getting used to proper attribution of quotes, I would recommend that you stick to attribution at the end unless it's going to make a quote confusing. All right, avoid using a quote in a lead. I've already said that. Maybe a partial quote is okay, but instead it's generally better to paraphrase or to just come up with something, a nugget of information that you've learned that you think makes an awesome lead. You often set up quotes with a paragraph that indicates who is about to talk and what he or she is about to say. This is particularly critical for broadcast because in broadcast you can't go back, or it's very rare to be able to go back and listen to what somebody had to say previously. So It's not unusual for you to give like a one-sentence paragraph that introduces you to the person that you're about to hear from in the quote. So we saw that with the President Obama story. He's referenced in the paragraph before the direct quote, and then in the direct quote it simply says, "he said." Now, for this class, you are going to present direct quotes in their own paragraphs. So don't just lump it all together. Break every quote into its own paragraph. So it should look something like this. Detective Jason Smith said suspects should be considered armed and dangerous. So that's a setup sentence paragraph leading into the direct quote. You notice how the direct quote is in its own paragraph, and then followed by a related line coming out of the quote. So this is how to set up a quote introducing the speaker before we actually read what he or she has to say. A few more things about quotes. You should avoid using back-to-back quotes. I just told you that earlier, without indicating a speaker change. So if you've got two people reacting to news of a new recruit that Ole Miss picks up on signing day, you will want to make sure that you identify each of those people separately. All right, I should not have to tell you this, but this is critical. Never, ever, ever make quotes up. I have had students do this. They did not pass this class, and they went through a very painful process of being reported to the university. So much better to get a grade that you are not going to appreciate as much than to make quotes up and fail this class. Edit quotes very cautiously. Sometimes when you talk to somebody, they'll ramble a bit and they will use words like well. Now, you don't have to put all of those sort of stammers into the quote. You want to, as much as possible, say exactly what the person had to say. And it's also important for you to remember that you are actually responsible for the quotes you use. I think sometimes journalists believe that if they're quoting someone and attributing that information to someone, that it's not their words. But you're responsible for putting that quote into the story. You're responsible for its accuracy. You're responsible for whether or not it unfairly portrays a situation, a person, a business, that type of thing. So we're going to start our first lecture about AP style. And AP style is the most commonly used tool to essentially guide the way you punctuate, use words, capitalize. It's similar to like MLA or APA in terms of there are rules about the ways that you use language in news stories. So there are rules about punctuating quotes, and a couple of friends of mine from VCU School of Mass Communications have come up with what I think is a really good and brief primer on AP style as it relates to quotes. So periods with quotes. Periods will always go inside the quotation marks. Even if the attribution is first, the period goes inside the quotation mark as it ends the sentence. If the attribution is in the middle, if the quotation ends the sentence, the period goes inside the quotation mark. If it's a standalone, its own response to a question, the period goes inside the quotation mark. So stick with the idea that the period goes inside the quotation mark, and you will be right. So let's try this. Look at this sentence. Governor Phil Bryant said, "Mississippi is at the crossroads." Is this sentence wrong or right? It is wrong because that period is not inside the quotation mark. Ole Miss Chancellor Dan Jones praised her for her honesty and intellect. This is a partial quote. Is this right or wrong? It is correct because that period goes inside the quotation mark. What about commas? Well, same rule applies. Commas, like periods, go inside the quotation mark. Obviously, you see on the first one, you're going to be attributing it after the quote, so there's a comma before that quotation mark, followed by the attribution. When the attribution comes in the middle, You're going to have 2 commas here. It ain't over, comma, he said, comma, until the fat lady sings. So that's where it gets a little tricky, and that's why I'm recommending that you stick with attribution at the end. It will simplify your ability to get your quotes punctuated correctly. So let's try it. The lawyer said, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Is this right or wrong? It is wrong because there's no comma separating the attribution from the quote itself. The lawyer said the jury should acquit his client. Anything wrong with this? It's correct. There's no quotation in there at all, so there's really no need for a comma in this particular sentence. This is a paraphrase, and so it's not going to need quotation marks, and you're not going to necessarily need a comma unless it's, a complex sentence, and then you might, or compound sentence, excuse me, and then you might. So attributing quotes. Why are the words said or says the best words to use when attributing quotes? Because they're neutral words. They don't give us any sense of bias or point of view. If I say, Deb Wenger claims that periods go inside quotation marks, that indicates that maybe there's something about what I had to say that's not accurate, right? If you say Deb Wenger said that periods always go inside quotation marks, that's really neutral. It doesn't say whether I'm right or wrong. So use the words said or says when attributing the information that you are putting in quotes, paraphrases, or partial quotes. You will never get yourself in trouble. It may feel like you're saying the same word over and over in your story, but those are words that people don't even actually notice when they're reading or when they're listening because they don't convey meaning. So you have some assignments on Blackboard as usual. Make sure as we move toward beginning your first story draft that you keep your notes from this lecture, refer back to it, and make sure that you are punctuating quotes correctly.